It's fine. That's absolutely fine. We like to keep some time for reporters to ask questions, but again, if your content is compelling, I think it's important to have that content as well. So we'll play it by ear if you guys don't mind, and hopefully we'll stay within our time schedule.
Welcome to our weekly Zoom conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, our topic is gun violence and domestic violence. Both are on the rise. Is there a link? Gun sales and domestic violence have both increased by more than 20% during the COVID pandemic. The data suggests there is a close connection. 4.5 million women have been threatened with a gun by their domestic partner. 1 million women have been shot and 600 have been killed. Children are often victims and increasingly perpetrators of these crimes. Our speakers today provide expertise as well as personal experience. They include Pauletta Perez, board member, Voices Against Violence, Loretta Cutaletta, and Tiffany Garner, both with the Giffords Law Center, and Chika Hamilton with Brady United to End Gun Violence. You will get extended bios from us after the conference. And we will also email any collateral and the video of the conference this afternoon. Our thanks to the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence for their continuing support of our work in the field. To reporters, enter questions in the chat box. We will ask our speakers to also monitor those questions and answer them as you see fit on the chat or during the conference. To our speakers, please speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And now I turn the microphone eagerly over to my colleague, veteran journalist, Sunita Sarabji. Sunita.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Let's get right to it. We begin with Pauletta Perez, who is a survivor and will share her very personal story with us, along with the advocacy work that she's now doing. Pauletta, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here.
Well, my name is Pauletta, and January 2nd of 2010, I experienced domestic violence, I'd say to the ultimate extent. I was shot by my husband a total of 5 times, 4 times in the head. That was a day, I can tell you. I remember hearing a noise that was very loud, to turn around to see a gun very close to my head. He was standing within 2 feet of me, very close. And I had been shot for the first time, but I had the wherewithal to turn around and see that he was pointing a gun at me and shooting at me. As I turned, he continued shooting. I continued to try to dodge bullets. I don't know where that necessarily comes from, But when you're in a fight or flight mode, you do things that you never imagined. But somehow, after being shot 5 times, I was able to barrel past him to get myself out of the room and downstairs and to my front door. Made it that far, and unfortunately, I did not know what to do with the door. So I believe something was setting in, but I made it to the door. I finally figured out how to turn the doorknob to open the door, and I ran out. Went to a neighbor and went to a few neighbors actually until someone could help me. Imagine opening the door and there's a lady standing there who's bleeding profusely from the head, asking for help. My husband just shot me. I had one brave neighbor who right away called the police. The others just stood in shock. Prior to that day, I had experienced abuse in my relationship with my husband, but after we were married, never before. Once we were married, I experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, as well as financial abuse. And because I believed that I was a fighter in my own right, I had worked very hard in my career. I had done several things that I was proud of. Did the day come that he would want to take my life? I did not understand that. This is the person who I trusted the most. And having guns in my household was something that I never wanted. The first time that I knew he had a gun was he actually was pulled over by the police, and they searched his car and found a gun there, and they took away that gun. And he told me of his ordeal that day and told me that he can't believe they took away his gun. He is a business owner and he should carry his gun to his place of business every day. I was thrilled, no more guns. And so that day went on, and I never thought, would he ever attempt to use a gun on me? Of course, he didn't have it anymore. So I never thought anything like that, although I was going through domestic violence. And I really didn't know I was actually going through domestic violence either. That is another problem that we have here. I was always taught growing up, and even as an adult coming into womanhood, if someone hits you, you hit them back. Of course, hitting a man back doesn't do anything except maybe hurt your hand a little bit. But I thought, okay, he left me alone, so I'll be fine until the next time. Well, the next time would come, and then the next time kind of slowed down a little bit, because this was going to be the final time in his mind, the day he shot me. Just a moment, let me gather myself here. You may wonder, where did he get this gun? Well, my father, who 2 years prior had a stroke, and he was an avid gun enthusiast. My father asked him to please take his guns, which were all legal and registered, and drop them to the police department. He could no longer shoot due to his stroke. Well, it turns out that my husband never turned in those guns. He shot me with my father's gun. So I do believe that the increase of domestic violence and the increase of gun sales and purchases will contribute most definitely to the increase of deaths caused by gun violence, especially in a domestic violence situation. I can tell you that I am very thankful to be here today. I fought hard for my life. My husband on that day committed suicide, and that relieved me of having to face him in long court battles and divorce and different things of that nature. However, once I got well, I wanted to do something and I wanted to make a difference. I did not want any other person to go through what I went through. I could have easily been still, curled up in the fetal position, because that's the person I trusted with my life who tried to take it. And I chose another route. I chose to do something. And once I understood, yes, ma'am, you have been involved in a domestic violence relationship for quite some time, to many degrees, I decided that I wanted to do something, and I decided to become an advocate. So I took the training and I started my advocacy work at that point. I joined a local organization here and began doing the work. Whatever I could do, I just began doing the work. And now I have people from all over the world who reach out and ask for help. They don't know what to do. What is the first thing that I should do? People here locally just need a hand to hold to go to court. People who are ready to leave need protection. So we help by preparing temporary restraining orders. So there's quite a bit we do as an advocate here in California. And participating on the board of Voices Against Violence has really opened my mind. And it lets me know that every day that I wake up, there is someone out there who I could potentially help. And I always say, each one, save one. Thank you.
Pauletta, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I have a couple of questions, and then there are several questions for you in our chat. How long did it take you to recover, and what was that process?
I would say it was about 6 to 7 years to fully recover. I had several procedures and surgeries that were needed in order to remove bullet fragments that remained after my trip to the hospital. That initial trip to the hospital was to save my life. After that, I took it upon myself to continue my treatment. So I did have further surgeries and procedures. I lost hearing on my right side, and I spent probably 2 years trying to figure out how I could potentially get that hearing back. So that was quite a while to finally learn that I would never hear again. The ability to speak, and this is so important to me today, because it took me about just between 6 to 7 years to be able to speak clearly and not lose the words. So I had therapy, learning how to speak again formulate sentences well. I could write, but I just could not speak well. I went back to work, actually bandaged up crazy with all the things around my head, and my employer allowed that. I couldn't do anything. I could just show up. They allowed me to do that. And that helped me also get back into the swing of things, because I felt like I was participating, although maybe I was not. So it was about 6 to 7 years just of practicing the everyday things, also doing different exercises. Having smartphones at that time was like the best thing ever. I found that using coordinating, color coordinating, eye coordinating, and games like that were a big help to keeping me focused, because I still drifted off, and I was on quite a bit of medication for a long time. So it's been that long. I still have bullet fragments in my head that cannot be disturbed. They are very close to causing damage, or even causing me to potentially die if one was to cut into the right area. So I am constantly tested every 3 to 6 months on where the location of the bullet fragments that I have are in my head. And I must do that for the rest of my life.
Pauletta, our first question comes from Arceli Martinez. Arceli?
Hello, Sunita, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Please ask your question. Arceli is from La Opinion.
Hi, Pauletta. It's very sad listening to you. I send you a big hug. You almost made me cry, so I feel so bad listening to you. So I would like to ask you, what do you recommend women who live with abusive men and they own and keep guns at home? I know it's not easy to to take the decision to leave a man, because we are in love with them and it's not easy. So, and it takes time to realize that we are in a dangerous situation. What would you recommend women that are living in these conditions?
First, I recommend that all women know what weapons are in your house. That's first and foremost. Know what is in your house. Secondly, know that the weapons that are there are legal weapons. If you happen to be a gun enthusiast along with your husband, I can understand that you collect together, you shoot together, and you do those different things. But always know what weapons are in your house and what weapons are legally registered. That's huge, because if something should happen to you, you want to make sure that they can trace back the weapon to where the weapon came from, who owned the weapon. Outside of that, it is very difficult if you ever are approached, assaulted, or if anyone ever shows you that they have a weapon and that they will harm you with it, or they tell you they will harm you with it, listen.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta.
Thanks, Sunita. Pauletta, do you have children? And if so, how are they doing, and how did you explain the situation to them?
Well, fortunately, we did not have children in the home. We had children each from prior marriages. I only had one child. And at the time that this happened, my son was already of age and grown. And the sad part about it is that my son was incarcerated at the time, so I would not allow anyone to talk to him about what had happened to me because he was not aware. And I did not tell him what had happened to me until 5 years later.
Dear. Why didn't you tell him?
I did not want him to be in the environment he was in, knowing that, you know, I could have died or someone tried to kill me or any of that. I needed him to be able to focus on doing what he needed to do before I could reveal that to him.
Our final question for you comes from Raymond Gao of China Press. Raymond, please ask your question. I will ask it for Raymond in the interest of time. Raymond asks, what was the environment that precluded your husband shooting you?
There was no argument. It was in the morning and I was just folding towels after doing laundry. So there was no fight, no argument, nothing at that time that would have precluded this. It was very quiet and I was just asked one question as I was putting away towels. And the question was, why are you talking about me? And I wasn't talking to anyone, actually, was very quiet. So I don't know what the trigger was. I don't know what the opportunity meant for it to happen at that point. But at that time that it happened, it did not happen due to an argument or a fight that had happened. I just thought I was going to be able to meet a friend for pancakes later that morning, which we did once a month. So I don't know what in his mind made him decide that was the day.
Pauletta, thank you so much for being on this call today. We really appreciate your presence here.
Thank
And
you
I
for
do
having
hope
me.
you stay on because we will have more questions for you after each of the speakers.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank
all
you.
right. Thank you again. We next move on to Tiffany Gardner and Laura Cutaleta of the Giffords Law Center, who will talk about the prevalence of gun-related domestic violence and how perpetrators are prosecuted. They're going to address a multitude of issues. We will start out with Tiffany. Tiffany, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, hello. I was like rumbling from the mute. Hello.
Hi,
By
welcome.
now- Hi. By now in our COVID times, you would think it's like, can we unmute? Oh, it's great to join you all today. Definitely bring you all greetings from the Northern Virginia area. So happy to join you in this very important conversation on domestic violence and firearms. I have a personal connection to this work even prior to my time at Giffords, and Laura will probably speak to this as well, just briefly. I come as a background in working as a domestic violence therapist and have seen so many cases of families, women impacted not only just by domestic violence, but complicated by the presence of firearms. And Pauletta, thank you so much for sharing your story, and we'll continue to keep you lifted in your healing journey. But absolutely, these cases are absolutely prevalent. And it's sad, but I think there's more that we can do in supporting victims, but also cracking down on these gun laws. So I'm just going to share a few thoughts, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Laura. But I just wanted to make sure we had a definition of what domestic violence is as we're kind of moving in this conversation. And that domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors that demonstrate power and control, as Ms. Pauletta shared in elements of that in her story. But it's also always between an intimate partner relationship. So married or dating or some variation of an intimate partner relationship. And one thing we all on this call probably want to make sure we lift up is that anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. Victims come from all walks of life. all race, education levels, economic levels, ethnicities. So we want to make sure everyone has
Tiffany,
a understanding.
slow down just a
Oh,
bit for our
yes.
interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. So yeah, so I was just sharing that victims come from all different variations and walks of life. So there is no one cookie cutter form of a victim. Just talking briefly about the use of guns in domestic disputes, we know that the presence of guns, it doesn't matter what type of intimate partner relationship, especially that, and Laura will touch on this too, about the presence of guns, also when children are involved, and how that can also exacerbate the situations. But the combination of intimate partner violence and access to firearms is often a very deadly mixture. Both are preventable public health concerns. The nexus of guns and domestic violence puts women at a tremendous risk. We see that in the United States, women are 21 more times likely to be killed with a gun than in other high-income countries. This statistic was already raised earlier, that more than 600 women are shot by intimate partners, and that's roughly 1 every 14 hours. And so we think about a day, how many women were not only just impacted by domestic violence alone, but also included the element of a gun. That's very startling. There are over 1 million women alive today who have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. And another statistic that's alarming is 4.5 million women report that a partner has threatened them with a gun. So we could go on with statistics, but these should register and let us know how serious this is and how many lives, families, children that this situation is impacting, and unfortunately, how many women are killed ultimately by the presence of firearms. Moving forward to look at the frequency, how often these continue to occur. I mentioned the 1 every 14 hours, but we look at how these firearms can be used to intimidate, control, coerce, threaten, injure. And I know Ms. Pauletta mentioned that what could have happened if her situation would have escalated. But we look at the assaults involving guns are 12 times more likely to result in deaths than other weapons or bodily force. While men and women are killed by intimate partners, because I want to bring in the aspect of men too, women are the ones much more likely to be the victims. So we look at one other statistic here that's just alarming for me too, is that 78% of intimate partner homicide victims are women. 98% of those women are killed by male partners. Continuing on, just looking at the aspect of the prosecution of these cases, there is an existing gap tracking prosecution, of DV cases on a national scale. Most domestic violence cases are handled in in a civil context. But there are a variety of reasons why domestic violence cases do not go to court. And some of those reasons could include the victim doesn't seek protective orders, or they may decide to withdraw, or maybe they decide to decline any legal remedy. In civil domestic violence actions, you are asking the court to protect you from that person. You're not asking the courts to send that person to jail, but there are different reasons why women say, I choose not to even take this situation further. And of course, looking at the criminal law aspect, that's where you have cases that involve violations of criminal law, such as harassment or assaults or murders. Some of the challenges and things that we think about when prosecuting cases is that the prosecutor, which, this is interesting, they have to prove that the offender and the victim had a statutorily defined domestic violence relationship, and that the alleged victim, at minimum, feared imminent harm from the alleged offender, meaning that harm would be immediate and that the offender could actually cause the harm. So when we look at the context of why often in prosecuting, the challenges of prosecuting cases, but oftentimes why women and victims choose not to take this further, there's a lot that could be involved in court cases. And also think about the element that if an offender or an abuser is continuously harassing or threatening or stalking in the midst of a court process or in the midst of a victim seeking legal remedies, that absolutely could deter what needs to happen to protect that victim and her family or that victim from their from further, abuse, of course. So I will also just want to make sure that the audience knows that often offenders or abusers will do different manipulative tactics to try to sway victims from proceeding or from moving forward with court cases. So there's a variety of reasons behind that. One other thing when it comes to prosecuting cases is that the prosecutor will need evidence to satisfy this case. That could be photos, that could be video, that could be testimony. And that often is hard to prove in some cases where there may not be a lot of physical evidence. Of course, we see the extreme when you have cases where someone has been physically harmed, but there may be cases in the emotional and mental abusive realms where there may not be a lot of the evidence available or the abuser has destroyed it. So many things that can happen in prosecuting cases. When it comes to sentencing perpetrators, when a gun is involved, there could be several scenarios that a perpetrator can face. A gun doesn't necessarily have to be involved to result in a prohibition. Perpetrators can face multiple counts. Oftentimes it could depend on if it's classified as a non-DV case or DV case, but it depends on the severity. So perpetrators can have more than one charge. It could be a simple assault, or it could be an aggravated assault. It could be stalking added onto the charges. It just depends on how severe the situation is. And so the sentencing also can vary per state, and looking at the laws there per state as well. So the completed sentence can range from probation to jail time and fines. It's just going to vary state by state. And lastly, just to kind of wrap it up before I turn it over to Laura, these cases are often dismissed. It's difficult to account for the exact numbers of how many of these cases are dismissed with plea deals. We can't really track down the exact numbers, but according to the Bureau of Justice Assistance, it is estimated that the overwhelming majority of cases, they're estimated between 90 to 95% of cases, result in plea bargains. There's also some reasons why another element to some victims who don't choose to even pursue a restraining order or some sort of legal remedies is also when it comes to communities of color. Many do not want their spouse, no matter how hard and difficult they've treated them, they don't want a man of color to go down the road of plea bargains and other penalties that may come because of what's going to happen if you, in the communities of color, if you have just a charge against you, how that may impact the family unit later on because of that person has a criminal charge. And that goes to a greater systemic issue that I won't go that far on, but that is another reason why people don't go this route, even with plea bargains. But one thing to remember is that those reasons why people may choose plea bargains rather than going to trial is because when you go to trial, you typically receive a harsher sentence. So anyways, I'm going to just switch gears and just say, Ms. Laura, I have a few other closing thoughts, but we can say this at the very end of our presentation. So I'm gonna turn it over to you to finish the rest of our thoughts about DV and firearms.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. So I just wanted to quickly talk about the legal framework that's in place to restrict access to firearms by those who have committed domestic violence. So there are two main ways that we do this with the law. The first is prohibiting people from purchasing or possessing a gun if they've been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. This is federal law, and there are also numerous states that have enacted this law as well. It's a very important law, but there are a few issues that are worth pointing out that decrease its effectiveness. First, the law is only as good as the background check system that's in place. So unfortunately, at the federal level, background checks are only required when purchasing from a licensed dealer. A purchase from a gun show or from a private party who's advertising a gun on the internet doesn't require a background check. If no background check is required, no one will find out that there's a domestic violence prohibition. However, many states, including California, but many others, have closed this loophole and do require background checks for all sales. The other loophole is what we call the boyfriend loophole. Federal law that I mentioned only applies to current or former spouses, parents, or guardians, a victim with a child in common, a current or former cohabitant. It doesn't apply to dating partners or former dating partners. So there's this loophole, and actually dating partners is a very common relationship type that where a lot of abuse can happen. But many states have fixed this problem as well by enacting their own laws. And we always encourage more states to do so. The other way that we restrict access to people who have committed abuse is through restraining orders, as Tiffany mentioned. Some of the same problems exist with the federal law that prohibits a person from owning a gun while a restraining order is in place. So the boyfriend loophole problem that I mentioned is there. The other problem is a restraining order often starts with an emergency procedure where a victim can get a restraining order ex parte, which means that the respondent is not given notice when the restraining order is put into place. Federal law does not prohibit the respondent during an order that's on an ex parte basis. This is very dangerous because, as we know from studies, this is one of the most dangerous times for the victim. We also know that states that have put laws into place that restrict access to guns by people subject to domestic violence restraining orders are very effective. States with these laws have seen a 13% reduction in intimate partner homicides involving firearms. And states that have done so for emergency ex parte protection orders have seen a 16% reduction. I also want to touch quickly on implementation. So we have these lots of laws in place in all 50 states and at the federal level, but if we don't implement them well, they will be much less effective at saving lives. And we also have a study showing that states that require people who are subject to domestic violence protective orders to provide proof that they actually relinquish their firearm are linked to a 16% reduction in intimate partner gun homicides. 28 states.
Sorry, Laura, could you please just explain what emergency ex parte is? There are a couple of questions that
Sure. Sorry.
and a little bit slower as well.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
So an emergency ex parte restraining order is when a victim asks a judge for protection through a court order, and the respondent or the person who has committed abuse has not been given notice that this has happened. So the respondent does not even know that the victim came to a court and asked for protection. There has not been a hearing. There's been no chance to respond to the allegations. And the judge is asked to deem whether or not the allegations are severe enough that the victim needs protection immediately, even without the respondent being given a chance to respond. After a period of time, the respondent will be given notice and a hearing is set up, and then the respondent can come and tell the other side of the story. So I'm just going to move on very quickly to children. As Tiffany mentioned, this is children are both victims of domestic violence, and they can also be perpetrators. So we know that as many as 10 million children and adolescents witness violence between their parents or caregivers each year. These children who are exposed to domestic violence can experience emotional, mental, and social damage that can affect their developmental growth. And male children in particular who witness domestic violence appear to be at a higher risk of using violence when they are older. And we know that having a gun in the house when a family is in crisis puts adults and children at risk of violence, including other forms of violence such as homicide, unintentional shootings, and suicide. And lastly, children and youth can also be perpetrators of domestic violence. Nearly 1 in 11 female and approximately 1 in 14 male high school students report having experienced physical dating violence in the last year. And 26% of women who were victims of sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner first experienced these or other forms of violence by that partner before the age of 18. And I will wrap it up there for questions.
Thank you, Tiffany and Laura. We have a number of questions. I'll ask the first question from Khalil Abdullah. Is there data on the refusal of women to decline pressing charges because they are financially dependent on the abuser? And I would add to that, is there also hesitation to decline to press charges because immigration status also depends on the abuser?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That is actually one of the barriers to people wanting to pursue any sort of legal remedy, or even just to tell other people in their own communities that this is happening because of immigration status. So that's absolutely it. And there may be, for the question about the financial, thank you. The first part of that question was whether there was data around the, I guess, the number of people who decline, I guess, the press charges. I'm sure there is maybe some national data just kind of giving a general picture. It may be more specific statewide because there's some mostly state coalitions around that can maybe give a more localized picture of what that looks like. But I'm just privy at this time to just maybe a national, a general overview of what that could look like. But to the point, there probably needs to be a lot more data collection around what the economic picture of what domestic violence looks like, to be honest. And Laura, you may know some other sources of where the data is housed around that.
Yeah, I don't actually know of anywhere that there's actually been data compiled on that or any studies done on that. But we know that it is absolutely a factor.
Absolutely. Pamela Cruz asked a question about where we can find data broken down by ethnicity and race as to women who experience domestic violence involving a firearm. Can you suggest some sources?
Sure. The FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program, the Supplementary Homicide Report, is a great place to go. And I put something in the chat from that report saying that Black women are nearly twice as likely as white women to be fatally shot by an intimate partner.
Thank you to you both. I see we still have a number of questions, but let's move on to Shika Hamilton from Brady. Shika, welcome.
Thank you, Sunita, and thank you to Ethnic Media Services for putting on this important conversation. And I now want to say thank you to Pauletta, Laura, and Tiffany. It's an honor to work with you and grateful that you're here today as well. This conversation, of course, is so important. And as has been discussed, there is an indisputable link between firearms and fatal outcomes in a domestic violence situation. In fact, the presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. This is a pressing issue in our country and for the gun violence prevention movement, a movement I've been a part of for 21 years. I started advocating for gun violence prevention with the Million Mom March back in the year 2000. I was a marcher and a mom, But as an Indian American, I was often struck by the difference, a chasm of difference between the environment and culture I had grown up in versus the pervasive gun culture here in America. Despite our unfamiliarity or even disinterest in firearms, I knew my family and I were still at risk of gun violence. No matter where you come from, your ethnicity or culture, that is a reality all of us must understand living in America. For so many communities in the United States, and especially for many in other countries who see our gun violence crisis, it can be perplexing why we continue to allow this to happen. Solving that crisis and keeping my family, friends, and community safe is what drew me to this work. And I've been here since, despite numerous setbacks. In my time in this movement, I've watched state legislatures pass incredibly comprehensive and thoughtful laws that will help reduce gun violence without targeting or increasing policing on vulnerable communities that already bear the brunt of this crisis. In my home state of California, we have led on preventing gun violence. For those of you that don't know, during the 1980s and early 1990s, California's firearm mortality rate was consistently higher than in the rest of the US. The state responded by enacting the strongest firearm laws in the country, and it worked. As California's strong firearm laws took effect, the state's firearm mortality rate began a steep decline. From 1993 to 2019, California's firearm mortality rate decreased 59%, almost 4 times the decrease in the rest of the nation. By 2019, the firearm mortality rate in California was substantially lower than the rate in the rest of the country. Strong gun laws work. And Sunita, I've attached the data for that for your audience. We have also led on preventing gun violence as it relates to domestic violence. Our state passed an extreme risk law following the 2014 mass shooting in Isla Vista. For those of you unfamiliar with that shooting was perpetrated by a 22-year-old with myriad mental health and other problems, but who had exhibited misogynistic tendencies and violent actions towards women in the past. Among other violent and deadly crimes, he attacked a sorority house, purposefully targeting women. The International Center for Counterterrorism at The Hague actually characterized that shooting spree as an act of misogynist terrorism. While different from a domestic violence restraining order, California's gun violence restraining order allows relatives, others, law enforcement to petition a court to issue a court order that temporarily removes the firearms and ammunition from individuals who are of concern or clearly at risk of harming themselves or others. Removing firearms from a home when someone is in a crisis saves lives. Roughly 54% of mass shootings are related to domestic violence or family violence. This is worthy of repeating. 54% of mass shootings are related to domestic or family violence. Domestic violence, gun violence, and mass shootings are inextricably tied together. In 2019 alone, there were a reported 700 gun violence restraining orders issued across California. This law is saving lives. Unfortunately, action is still stalled on a similar law at the federal level. It's why we continue to advocate for comprehensive bills at the federal level. Among those would be a federal extreme risk law, but also a bill expanding and strengthening our background check system, which Laura alluded to. That system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, has helped to stop nearly 2 million sales of firearms to prohibited purchasers. However, as Laura said, many sales, such as private transfers between individuals, are exempt from a background check, meaning someone can purchase a firearm, no questions asked. We need to change that, and 90% of Americans support it. But despite the fact that such a bill has passed the House of Representatives in the last 2 Congresses, this overwhelmingly popular bill is stopped by the Senate, where it will require 60 votes. This political threshold has stopped many needed changes over the years, especially related to gun violence prevention policies. Today, that background check bill, H.R. 8, is still awaiting a vote in the Senate because the NRA and the gun lobby have made it nearly impossible for many members of Congress to vote for this kind of bill, even though it is more popular than almost any other policy out there. And H.R. 8 isn't the only bill being held hostage either. For years, the Violence Against Women Act was a bipartisan and mutually agreed upon priority. However, that act has lapsed in 2018 and remains lapsed today because of the ideological and frankly ridiculous complaints over firearm provisions that would help ensure that abusers do not have access to guns. This is unthinkable when we know that women who were killed by a spouse, intimate partner, or close relative were 7 times more likely to have lived in homes with guns. As you can see, while we have made great strides with state legislation, which we must continue, federal legislation matters, and the influence of the NRA and politicization have stopped needed change. Even worse, that delay is costing lives. It is estimated that Americans own 393 million guns, and approximately 4.6 million children live in homes with a gun that is stored loaded and unlocked. 75% of school shootings are facilitated by kids having access to unsecured guns at home. And one more final devastating piece of news. According to new data, unintentional shooting deaths by children handling a gun jumped 31% during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic compared to the year before. With an average of 100 people dying every day from gun violence in this country means that every day we delay in passing needed laws, our fellow Americans, including children, are dying. I'm grateful for your attention to this issue and the other activists and leaders in this conversation. Together, we will be able to end this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Shika. Sandy Close has a number of questions for you, which I will ask for her. First, what are the most dangerous states for women in terms of domestic violence with guns?
Oh, Laura could probably answer this better. I bet she knows it off the top of her head, but I'm guessing it's some of the southern states, Laura.
Well, we do a scorecard every year that gives the states letter grades based on their gun laws, including domestic violence laws. And unfortunately, there are about half get Fs on our scorecard. And it is no coincidence that their gun death rates are also the highest. So there's a very strong correlation between weak gun laws and high gun death rates, and that includes for domestic violence. So, that's on our website. I can send a link. It will show you exactly the breakdown of every state and how they ranked.
Could
Yeah,
you
they have a
drop that
great
link?
website.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, could you please drop that link into the chat box? And that way all the reporters will have access to that. And then Sandy also asked, when a boyfriend or spouse kills or harms a child, is that also considered domestic violence? And is it prosecuted as such? I open that question up to any of the speakers.
Laura, that's that's the legal angle. I can answer it, but go ahead, Laura, I'll let you.
Yes, it would be. Domestic violence is defined as, there are different relationships that would qualify as domestic violence, and one of them would be a child. But there's also child abuse laws. So, it kind of depends on how the prosecutor wanted to try the case. It could be done through child abuse laws as well.
I have a question for all three of you, and that is the White House recently withdrew its nomination of David Chipman, a strong proponent of gun control. His nomination for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was withdrawn. What signal do you think this sends? Is Congress willing at this point to address this issue comprehensively?
Do you want my personal opinion? I think,
yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are really appalled at what's happening. The fact that ATF Bureau does not have a director is just appalling. Can you imagine that we're trying to regulate guns and we don't even have a director at the helm? And Dave Chipman was a highly qualified person to lead that effort. So it is very disheartening, but we're not going to let up. We're going to continue because we do deserve a qualified person to lead that bureau, and it will affect significantly how we continue to do firearm sales, inspections. There is a lot that needs to be done in that department, and we need a director as soon as possible.
Absolutely. I have a question for both Tiffany and Pauletta. Tiffany, you had mentioned the collection of evidence to back up charges of domestic violence. And in many cases, and I think of a very prominent case here in the Bay Area where a woman who had been abused for 9 years collected evidence. She tape recorded her husband abusing her, and yet that was not allowed in court. In another case that I wrote a lot about, a man beat up his girlfriend 163 times during the course of an evening. CCTV footage was captured. Policewoman managed to grab that. It was not allowed in court. So I asked that question of both of you. Pauletta, how difficult is it for the victims that you work with to be able to gather that kind of evidence? And then Tiffany, what are the restrictions allowing that evidence to be introduced in the case? Pauletta?
Yes, it's very difficult. Anytime that there is any form of abuse, it needs to be documented. And I've told women all the time, the best friend you can have is a USB drive. And when you get those photos, move them over to that USB drive and get them off your phone. Anything that you keep on your personal self will, your partner or your spouse will have access to. So whatever you do to gain any bit of evidence, whether it's a recorded message, a threat by text message, any of that, make sure you keep all of that. And the only thing that you make sure to leave home with when you leave is your children and that thumb drive.
Thank you, Pauletta. Tiffany?
May actually have to lean on Laura, more of a legal scholar on the restrictions. Our one of our other teammate members tells a little bit more about the restrictions. But I would just probably would just lean on the fact it depends on your prosecutor and kind of where they are as far as what they will allow permissible in the courts. I think some court systems are a little bit more lenient, and not lenient as far as I guess understanding a little bit more about domestic violence and what they will allow. But I don't know, Laura, do you have any idea on restrictions in cases from the legal side of that?
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the details of the cases that you're talking about to know why they weren't allowed in court, but I'm guessing it was because of the rules of evidence, which are very detailed and complicated. It's been 20 years since I've represented victims in court, but I do remember that things like recordings, a lot of times, it depends on whether the other person knew what they were being recorded. And there's, if the respondent or defendant has a lawyer, then they will do everything they can. And that's their job, to try to keep evidence out of court. And if they're able to make a legal argument that's convincing to the judge, then they will succeed, even if the judge, recognizes that it would be very helpful in deciding the case. Unfortunately, it's a little bit the problem of our court system is not necessarily the best or the perfect tool for addressing these problems. And it's the phrase that comes to mind for me is, when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So, you're trying to fix something with a hammer that really maybe needs a different solution, but it's one of the only things we have.
Absolutely. I'd like to go back to all four speakers and ask for a quick 30-second soundbite of the most important thing that you would like our reporters to take away from this conversation. I will start with you, Pauletta.
I would say, taking away from this conversation, the most important thing that I would like you all to know is that there are many women today suffering in silence, and we need to be able to speak about this. We need to be able to provide information, education, resources, so that these women do not have to perish in their silence.
Thank you, Pauletta. Tiffany?
Yeah, absolutely. So takeaways from my side is make sure that we understand the importance of taking threats seriously, and even the past acts of violence, making sure we taking those seriously and recognizing how easy it is to access firearms. That will increase your risk of injury and fatal injury for victims as well as their children. I think there's also importance for us addressing systemic issues that allow misogyny and other forms of violence to remain in place. And then also making sure that we have remedies in place, maybe looking through providers that can screen for violence, but also provide information on how to reduce risk that address through our legal system, through restraining orders that can comprehensively address domestic or gender-based violence and risk associated with firearms. So I think those are some 3 takeaways that I can kind of think about. But anyway, so glad to join you all today.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Laura?
I think I would say that domestic violence is everyone's problem, and is not just something that happens in the home that we don't have to concern ourselves with. And I think Shika gave some really great stats about mass shootings. And that's a perfect example, when there's a mass shooting, a lot of times when we find out that it's domestic violence related, the media kind of moves on and starts covering something else because, that's just a interpersonal matter. And I think it's important as journalists to think about domestic violence as a problem that we are all responsible for educating the public about and creating solutions for.
Thank you so much, Laura. And last, Shika.
Thank you. I would say, I would request of the journalists here today is, don't forget about these shootings. Oftentimes mass shootings take over the news, and the everyday shootings get ignored. And oftentimes they're the domestic violence shootings. And so please, as journalists, please continue to tell those stories. And secondly, I would ask that all of you have a ready-made question: where did the gun come from? Because oftentimes that will lead you to a bigger story, because we are busy working to curb the illegal flow of guns into communities. And so it's important as journalists, as partners in this work, that you ask that question every single time. Where did the gun come from? And finally, ask legislators, why are they not passing HR 8 that requires all gun sales to have a background check? It's common sense. I think everybody can understand this issue. Why are they not passing that law? And that will lead you to also another bigger story about the gun lobby and money and all of that. So I thank you so much for this time. And please feel free to reach out to us for any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to the reporters who joined us today. Sandy, any closing remarks? You're done. Okay. All right.
It
We
was
can-
terrific. Thank you. It was
Thank you, Sandy.
Take care, everyone.